Hi, I'm Deacon Matt Newsom, the Catholic campus minister at Western Carolina University, and I'd like to welcome you to our introductory video for our Advent reflection series, God with Us, reflecting on the Incarnation with St. Athanasius. This is going to be an 8-part series during Advent, or really 9 parts if you count this introductory video. We're going to be releasing a new video every Tuesday and Thursday during the 4 weeks of Advent, looking at one chapter each of the ancient Christian document on the Incarnation by St. Athanasius. So before we get into that itself, I thought it was important to have a little bit of background information on who St. Athanasius was and why he was writing about the Incarnation. When we're actually looking at our reflections, we're not going to be looking at church history. This is not a history series. We're going to be looking just at Athanasius's text on its own, taking it at face value to help us to prepare joyfully and with greater understanding for the celebration of the Nativity of Christ, the Nativity of Emmanuel, God with us, at Christmas. But just to help us understand the context that this document was written in, I wanted to give a little bit of history first. So that's what we're going to be doing in this introductory video. So who was St. Athanasius and why was he writing on the Incarnation? Well, he was a bishop of Alexandria during the 4th century. And Alexandria was one of 2 great centers of Christian learning and education in the ancient world, the other one being Antioch. Athanasius was born sometime around the year 296, and he died in the year 373. So his life really did span almost the entire 4th century. The church was still very young during the 4th century. It had just recently emerged out of this period of great persecution by the Roman Empire, and it had become legal, and not only legal, but popular within the ruling classes of the Roman Empire. And so we were starting to get a lot more converts coming into the church from pagan religions. And this produced a culture clash, so to speak, because most pagan religions' understanding of God or the gods were of distant divinities that couldn't really be bothered to care much about human affairs. And so this idea that God would actually enter into the world and become one of us, which is what the Incarnation is, was quite different, quite a different way of conceiving of divinity. Now, Athanasius is perhaps most well known as being one of the principal defenders of the Catholic faith against the Arian heresy. And the Arian heresy is one of the most divisive, dangerous heresies that the early church had to deal with. And it had its origins right here in the 4th century. So to understand St. Athanasius and why he was writing about the Incarnation and his place in history, we have to know a little bit of something about Arianism. So Arianism is named after a priest named Arius, who was a priest in Alexandria in Egypt, although he had been educated in Antioch at the other great Christian school. And sometime around the year 317, 318, he started to preach in a series of sermons an understanding of Christology, an understanding of Christ that said Christ was less than God the Father. He was willing to attribute to Christ pretty much every divine aspect except for divinity itself. And his understanding was simple, and it made sense to a certain degree. Christ is the Son of God. That means he must somehow be less than God the Father. For him to be the Son of the Father, that implies that there was a time when the Son did not exist. Therefore, the Son couldn't be eternal like the Father was eternal. And I have to point out that at this time that Arius was preaching, our understandings of Christology and Trinitarian theology, the relationship between the 3 persons of the Holy Trinity, and specifically the relationship between Christ the Son and God the Father, was not yet really well defined. And it was actually controversies like this that led the church to come up with specific definitions of just what we believe about the relationship between the 3 persons of the Trinity. So at the time that Arius was preaching this was not a settled subject. It was something that theologians were thinking about and praying about. And this was his ideas around it, that Christ was less than God the Father. He was not the same as God the Father. So this kind of caught the ear of his bishop of Alexandria, who at the time was not St. Athanasius. It was a man named Alexander. And so Alexander summoned Arius and heard his views and ultimately decided, no, what you're preaching is not compatible with the Catholic faith as we have received it. That is, Christ is God. So please stop preaching this. And Arius refused, and at that point he was in disobedience to his bishop. Lots of bishops in the area agreed with Bishop Alexander that, that Arius was wrong. But Arius had his supporters as well. He had some bishops that were on his side that thought, no, what he was preaching made sense. And so the controversy kind of spread beyond just the Diocese of Alexandria and really created a lot of chaos within the church as people took sides. That ultimately led to the calling of the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, where all of the bishops gathered together and they discussed and debated this issue. And ultimately what came out of that council was the Nicene Creed that we continue to proclaim every Sunday at Mass, where we profess our belief that Christ is consubstantial with the Father, or the Greek word that's used there is homoousios with the Father. It means of the same substance, the same essence, the same being. He is one with God the Father. In other words, Christ is God. Christ is God. But the Council of Nicaea didn't end the Arian controversy. In many ways, it was just the beginning, because not every bishop in the church accepted the definition of Nicaea, and it continued to be a point of division within the church for decades and really centuries later. And it's during this post-Nicene conflict that St. Athanasius really shone. He became Bishop of Alexandria in the year 328, only 3 years after the Council of Nicaea. And he was less than 30 years old at the time. And that was remarkable then, just like it would be remarkable now for someone who is under the age of 30 to be ordained a bishop, let alone bishop of one of the major sees of the church. And that's just testimony to how respected Athanasius was, that they would name him bishop at such a young age. And he became one of Arianism's harshest critics. Athanasius was a prolific writer. He wrote many things. Many of his works still survive today. But On the Incarnation is probably his most famous work. He suffered great persecution at the hands of Arians and their political allies. He would be exiled from his diocese anytime an Arian supporter was in political power. He was exiled 5 times before he died in 373. During one of those 5 times, he actually went into the desert in Egypt and lived as a desert hermit. In fact, he met St. Anthony. He knew St. Anthony, founder of monasticism, and one of the works that he wrote was a biography of St. Anthony. He, I think, probably would have much preferred to live his life as a hermit than as a public figure like a bishop, although that's where God was calling him to use his gifts. So why did St. Athanasius care so much about the Arian controversy and want to spend his life combating it not with, steel and swords, but combating it with his words and with his preaching and with his prayer? Well, apart from the fact that Arianism was a source of great division within the church, and that's not a good thing, Athanasius understood the real implications of Arianism were it to be accepted. Because if it's true, if what Arianism preaches is true, that Christ was less than God, it would have great adverse implications to the faith. For one, that would mean it wasn't God who died on the cross. And if God himself did not die on the cross, that means that sacrifice offered for all mankind would not truly be a universal, perfect sacrifice. It would be something less than that. And it would also mean that the practice of Christians since the beginning of the church of worshiping Christ as our God would be idolatrous. Because if Christ was anything less than God, if he was just simply the greatest of all of God's creatures, which is what Arians held, it would be like us worshiping St. Michael the Archangel or worshiping the Blessed Virgin Mary. As much as we venerate these great saints, for their holiness, we don't worship them because they're not God. And so if we worshiped Christ as God and he was not, he was merely the greatest of all of God's creatures, that would turn all of Christian worship into idolatry. And so Athanasius saw these greater implications of Arianism and how dangerous they would be. And so he fought hard against them. On the Incarnation, like I said, is his most famous work, and it's short. It's less than 100 pages if you buy it in print. I encourage you to read it if you're going to be following along with us during this series. You don't even have to buy a copy. You can find it for free online in English translation. Just Google On the Incarnation, St. Athanasius. In fact, I'll put a link in the description of this video on YouTube. So we're going to be looking at it one chapter at a time. There are 8 chapters, and so there'll be 8 videos after this. He begins on the Incarnation by describing Christ's role in the act of creation, which is a beautiful way to begin because, of course, the Arians were teaching that Christ was himself a created being. And so what better way to refute that than showing how Christ was, in fact, active as a cause of creation. And then from that starting point, Athanasius starts to develop reasons why the Incarnation happened, why the creator of the universe would want to enter into the universe and become part of the universe. And we'll be talking about that the reason ultimately boils down to love, God's great love for us. And that's still relevant for us today. In Athanasius's time, in the 4th century, people were teaching false information about Christ that led them into heresy and led them to a denial of the faith. And in our own time, we still have people that are teaching false information about Christ. There are people out there who teach that Jesus was just a myth. He didn't even exist as a historical figure. There are many people out there that teach that Jesus was just a man. And they'll even say he was a good man or even a great man, a prophet even, but that he wasn't God. That the idea that this man, Jesus, was God himself is a Christian myth. And from there, the whole fabric of the Christian faith begins to unravel. So if we know the truth about who Christ is, and that would help us then to stay rooted in the church that Christ founded. And we can also be inspired by St. Athanasius' heroism in his defense of the faith, even in the midst of his own personal persecution. When he was told that the world was against his teaching about the divinity of Christ, Athanasius replied, "Then I am against the world." And sometimes it can feel like that for Christians today, that the world is against us. And so this can give us courage to say along with St. Athanasius, well, then I am against the world because I am for Christ. Because ultimately, Athanasius knew beyond a doubt that nothing that the world had to offer him could save him, that his only Savior was Jesus Christ, that nothing in the world could offer him the peace, the joy, and indeed the love that God offers us through the incarnation of his Son. So I hope that you'll join us for the rest of this Advent series every Tuesday and Thursday during Advent, and that can lead you to a greater joy at your own acceptance and celebration of the Incarnation. Praised be Jesus Christ.